Let's speak to our international editor, Isabel Oakeshott. Fascinating times, Isabel. What is your take on all of this? And especially for our viewers and listeners who might be thinking, what are tariffs going to actually, how are they going to affect us, especially if President Trump comes through with them? Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Well, this has all escalated a lot more than I think I anticipated. I think starting from a very simple point, Trump is not going to invade Greenland. I think that is highly unlikely. And the defence contacts that I've spoken to are pretty clear on that. What they think is going on here is what I think probably most people imagine, which is a kind of classic Trump rhetorical game in which what he's trying to do is get the EU and the UK to up their defence spending generally by sabre rattling and indicating that, you know, potentially he might pull out of NATO and then we'll be on our own. And if he were to be kind of able to buy Greenland, as it were, then he might feel he no longer particularly needs NATO allies, because he'd have that kind of great big area of influence and buffer zone, if you like. He'd have that security. Now, the other thing that is going on here is not just about American access to Greenland's mineral resources, but more about making sure that the Chinese don't have that access. And that is, you know, we talked a lot in this whole debate about what's going on in Greenland about Russia and China, but I think China is at least as important in the calculations that are going on. And there's a real dilemma for Starmer in how to handle this, or at least there ought to be a dilemma. Starmer's instincts, of course, are to sort of side with whatever the EU wants, and I think that's a trap for the UK. The UK could play quite an important and influential role here, actually being the kind of broker between where the EU stands on all of this and where the US stands. But unfortunately, Starmer's instincts are always sort of to tack towards Ursula von der Leyen and his old EU pals.
It's interesting what the thoughts on tariffs as well. I've got a very interesting message from Mary in County Down, who says Trump's policy on tariffs was nicknamed Taco for Trump always chickens out, due to his tendency to threaten high tariffs, only to withdraw the threat when he gets what he wants by other means, particularly negotiation. Can we all stop panicking now, please? Putting that together with your sources telling you there's no chance he's going to invade Greenland, should we actually be that worried, Isabel?
I mean, maybe not. You know, I just can't see a lot of this happening. But the thing about Trump and what is in a way so masterful about the way he manages international affairs is that there's just that little percentage of never quite know, isn't there? I mean, this is a president who is capable of doing pretty much anything, as we saw with what he's done in Venezuela. He's also capable of saying that he is going to do something by way of intervention in Iran and then not doing anything at all. You know, he said, don't worry, you know, to the dissidents, to those protesters on the street, help is coming. Well, help hasn't come. So he is not a president that we can remotely take at his word. And in a sense, you've always got to, if you're in charge of a country, whether it's the UK or the EU countries or whatever it is, you've always got to have a contingency plan just in case he actually follows through on some of the slightly more bonkers things that he sometimes floats.
I wonder as well, when he talks to the Prime Minister of Norway, saying that no one's done more for NATO since NATO was established. Do you think that's credible? And also whether you worry, as Tobias Ellwood has been, that he thinks that Trump would potentially withdraw from NATO, withdraw from the WTO, withdraw from the United Nations, become a much more isolationist nation. Do you think that's credible?
Well, I mean, I think it's some of it's credible. Just going back to what I said previously, you never know with Trump. You know, you remember the outrage when he withdrew from the Paris Agreement on climate change, and he likes withdrawing from international treaties like this. I mean, I have to say that, you know, even as someone that admires Trump's leadership in many ways, some of the language he uses is pretty childish, isn't it? That memo. Well, I didn't get the prize, so now I no longer need to think about peace, is sort of almost laughable. And when you consider what's at stake here, it's pretty concerning that it's being brought down to that level.
What do you make of the fact that it was Denmark themselves, actually, who colonised 3 islands, St Thomas, St John, and another island purchased by the United States in 1917, became known as the United States Virgin Islands? So the idea of US buying Greenland, hardly a wild and novel idea, is it? I mean, these things have happened before and have happened within the last sort of 100 or so years.
Well, I mean, we seem to be in the business of buying and selling islands ourselves.
With Chagos, yeah, exactly.
When I say we, I mean I'm certainly not part of any such thing. But this is a Labour administration that seems to think that buying and selling territory is entirely acceptable. And there is a huge inconsistency there, isn't there, in Starmer sort of standing up there saying it's a matter for the Greenlanders.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
To secure their own destiny. Well, what about the Chagosians? He didn't seem to have much care for them.
Very, very good point. There's another international story that I think is being forgotten here. We see it, of course, through the lens of Shamima Begum, who in theory could be back or could be out of Syria in a few days' time. But Syria in general, it's kicking off there. There was meant to be a ceasefire, but of course there've been many, many attacks between the government and the rebels there. Just bring us through that, Isabel, and tell us what it could mean for us.
Well, I mean, Syria has not had a lot of attention from the UK. You're talking about Syria at this point. I just want to check I heard you correctly.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Yes, so you're absolutely right that Syria has kind of fallen off the radar in terms of at least UK media coverage. I mean, it gets a huge amount here in the Middle East, where there's sort of every day there are updates on what's going on and the different alliances being formed. I think a lot of people sort of were labouring under the misapprehension that with its new president, formerly known as Jelani, a one-time jihadi type person, having been brought into the fold by President Trump, having been kind of normalised as a
sanitised. He even met Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, so he must be a lovely guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think people sort of thought, okay, we can just park Syria as everything's okay over there. And clearly that isn't the case at all. And I must admit, I've been lazy about following the ins and outs of just how stable various bits of Syria are. But it's something that I think we're going to need to re-engage with to some extent, save insofar as we're pretty thinly stretched in terms of international crises at the moment, and there's so much going on everywhere.
Yeah.
Where do you put your attention? Frankly, at the moment, I am much more worried about what's happening in Iran, or rather what's not happening in Iran.
Certainly, we'll talk more about Syria's army and the Kurdish-led Syrian Defence Forces militia alliance and the fresh clashes there a little bit later on. But just before you go, let's return to a political matter in the UK, Isabel, because Andrew Rossendale has now joined Reform UK. I, for one, wasn't that shocked. His views are pretty clearly with Reform UK. I've actually had him in this studio and asked a number of times whether he would think of defecting, and he has never said, absolutely not, that will never happen. Reform UK now have 7 MPs, 3 of them former Conservatives. Will that sit comfortably with the electorate? Will it sit comfortably with Nigel Farage?
Well, it must sit comfortably with Nigel Farage because he is the one who has welcomed those MPs into the Reform fold, and quite rightly so. People can't have it always. They can't. Reform's critics can't continually say Reform's a one-man band. Reform doesn't look like a government in waiting. Reform doesn't have enough experience, and then get all antsy when Reform welcomes MPs that have experience and can join the parliamentary party. I think the broader question is, does it alienate, to what extent does bringing in disaffected Tories into Reform's ranks, to what extent does that alienate Reform voters? And we know that some defections have gone down better than others, and there's no doubt that the defection of Robert Jenrick was hugely welcomed by most Reform members, because they can see that that Jenrick is ideologically aligned with them. But what they don't want, I think, is a merger. I mean, that is absolutely anathema to most Reform members, and certainly to Reform inclined voters who don't want to just think it's, they're all the same. That is the jeopardy for Reform. And I think Nigel, the leader, Nigel Farage, has thus far struck a really, really clever balance here. I don't envy his job, because he's got to sort of try to meet that "you don't have enough experience, you're a one-man band" thing, at the same time by not looking like Reform is just another version of the same old parties.
Isabel, thank you. That's Isabel Oakeshott, our international editor.